Hey there, back again. So let's talk about these group differences and why I tend to believe, based on research, that they're largely environmental in nature. So first, let's talk about the fact that genetically speaking, we are far more alike than we are different. Generally speaking, you are going to notice the genetic differences between people are often much, much larger than the genetics between two different groups in general. So we're more alike than we are different. That's also hitting on the idea that really race is not necessarily a very neatly defined biological category. It's more of a social construct in certain ways. And generally, what we're going to find over time is that very few people fit very neatly into one specific racial category or not. And that's especially true as our world gets smaller and we're able to interact with people from different cultures and different groups. Additionally, we do know that there are schooling effects. Generally, if you give a group of Black Americans and white Americans the same amount of information to be able to do well on a test, that they will perform similarly. So what we're potentially looking at here is not necessarily a genetic difference. And I would argue very strongly it's not. This is not a biological difference. This is due to privilege and access to information. And generally, if you're a part of an underprivileged group, you're often going to find that information is much, much harder for you to access. And that's going to put you at a disadvantage. Now, likewise, your schooling and culture tends to matter, though. Generally, we tend to find that educational policies like attendance, instructional time per year, are more likely to predict national differences in intelligence than anything else. For example, Japanese students tend to do a lot better than children from the United States, and that's because they take their schooling much more seriously. I believe here in the United States, we only have about 180 days worth of instruction. We get 3 months off in the summer. That does not happen in Japan. And they also go to school on Saturdays, and we do not. And so we tend to find that those kind of policies and keeping kids in school and keeping them educated does predict quite a few of those differences. We do also notice that over time, from generation to generation, groups of people are just getting more intelligent and are scoring more highly on IQ tests. And this is what's known as the Flynn effect. Interestingly enough, I'm actually starting to hear about certain cultures where that Flynn effect has actually maxed out, and they're actually getting an anti-Flynn effect where IQs are actually dropping a little bit from generation to generation. And here's probably one of the biggest things. You generally don't see a lot of racial or ethnic differences when you're looking at intelligence tests in infants. Or in young children. You don't really see this very much. It's only once children get sufficient exposure to their culture and they either get that access to information or that lack of access to information that we actually start to see those group differences. And I think taken together, this would kind of show that a lot of these group differences are tied in with things related to income inequality. They're tied into the quality of schools that people are going to, what infrastructure is available, different types of national policies, whether for schooling or tutoring or things like that. And that's really what is accounting for those differences. Now, your book takes this a step and goes, well, that doesn't mean that IQ tests are biased. And I'm kind of sitting here like, you give all these reasons that we've got this gap, and then you're going to say that IQ tests aren't biased. Clearly, there's something not right here if we're looking at these largely environmental effects. And I would say these tests are developed by people who value what the culture that is most privileged values. And that's what you're going to find on those tests. And that's going to put anybody who is marginalized at a disadvantage, whether that's race, ethnicity, income, education, whatever. So there are some gender similarities and differences as well. We do know that by and large, there are some, for the most part, men and women tend to perform similarly on IQ tests. However, there are some differences that are pretty robust and hold up over time. First of all, for males, there is a culture-specific finding that in math aptitude. Now, to be clear, you only really find that men do better in math aptitude and mathematical ability when you're looking at cultures where math is kind of treated as something for boys. So you tend to find it here in North America. You tend to not necessarily find that in cultures where math isn't immediately coded for men. In contrast, women are more likely to do better in measures of verbal performance. That is largely a socialization thing. There is research out there that shows that parents in general speak more words to their daughters than they do to their sons. And so we tend to speak less to boys, and because of that, we don't really give them the information that they need for that verbal performance. Men tend to do better on tests of mental rotation. Women tend to do better on tasks of object location. Women tend to do better at emotion detection. Again, I would argue this is largely socialization. Women are often socialized to be engaged in emotional labor, and that means managing other people's emotions. And so emotion detection is a very big, important part of that emotional labor. And then finally, we do know that men tend to have greater variability in IQ. You are far more likely to find men with very high intelligence than women. You are also more likely to find more men that have severe intellectual impairments and that IQ below 70 compared to women. Women tend to cluster a little bit more in that bell portion, that larger portion where most people tend to be. Men tend to be a little bit more spread out. So these are just some things that researchers have noted. Now, let's take some arguments against the racial explanation. There are some really heinous people out there that believe that these differences that we're seeing are due to biological differences, and actually making a case for biological superiority of different races or ethnic groups when really there is not necessarily a basis for that. And hello, we tend to share more genes than we think. So what are some evidence against this idea that these are innate differences and biological superiority and blah? I hate that kind of stuff. First of all, the gap is closing fast. Previously, research reported, for example, that the gap between Black Americans and white Americans was 15 points. About 10 years later, it's closed down to 10. And Latinx, people who are Latinx have also started to close that gap as well. Additionally, we do know that there is evidence out there that racial differences, and I would also say some of those gender differences, especially with math, can be flipped on and off like a switch. Now, I will note that these findings do occasionally have a failure to replicate, but I think they're also important to talk about. We have to talk a little bit about what is called stereotype threat. So anytime that you are taking a test, and this is especially true if you're a member of a marginalized group or a group that is told you don't really do all that well on tests. What's interesting is that it doesn't just become you have to do your best, but now you are a representative for your group. And oh man, you can't let them down by performing badly. So I've always felt this anytime I took a math test. I'm actually pretty good at math, but I'd always get nervous because, well, I've always heard girls don't do well at math. And if I don't do well on my math test, I'm not just doing poorly for me, I am letting down generations of women by not doing well. So it's a self-confirming concern that you will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. And what ends up happening is that because you're so concerned about this stereotype, it makes you anxious. And I certainly don't know about you, but when I'm anxious about my performance does not usually get better. It actually gets worse. So it does create a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. So there's some research by Steele and Aronson back in 1995 that actually showed evidence of stereotype threat. So they gave a group of white students and a group of black students SAT questions. And they were either told that the tests were non-diagnostic, so we're just trying out some new test questions for the SAT, try these out, see if you like them. So how you did on these questions was not diagnostic of your intellectual abilities in any sort of way. Now, on the other hand, another group of students was given a diagnostic explanation. How you do these are supposed to index your intellectual ability. So if you don't do very well, we'll know that you have some intellectual problems, that you're not as smart. And so most people know about the stereotypes that are present in their culture. And so what's interesting is that you can kind of see that for the white students, there's not really a lot of difference. Those error bars overlap, which means that there's not a lot of difference there. However, for the group that was non-diagnostic, the black students performed just as well as the white students. But once you start talking about these questions being indicative of intellectual capabilities, that stereotype threat kicks in, and the black students are suddenly significantly performing worse than the white students do. And so because of that, the fact that these can kind of be flipped on and off by a switch kind of shows that this may not necessarily be innate differences. It may not be due to biological differences. It's largely imbibing the culture and what the culture values. And this is true with women too. When women are asked to identify their gender on a math test just by checking a box, that's enough to sometimes kick off stereotype threat for math performance. So it's just kind of something to keep in mind. Now, I will say that the APA, part of the reason that your book argues that these tests are not culturally biased is because that's largely based on a statement given by the APA. And that's all well and good, but I don't think enough is being done. So if you have any questions on these, or if you have any ideas or any thoughts on IQ tests or these group differences in intelligence or these gender differences, feel free to comment, share your ideas with me, or we'll talk about them in class. So that's really all I had for Chapter 8. Make sure you listen to these. I want you to be prepared. And on Monday, we'll start talking about motivation. Bye.